Never Send a Fleet, or Terrans Taste Like Tziltskas, by Zarryiosiad. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Montclair's steady gaze and stern expression belied her true emotions as she watched the horrific footage. She wasn't sure how the Terran Diplomatic Corps had obtained it, but the Navy finally had a definitive answer to the question of what had happened to the missing humans on Niagara. She glanced at her fellow SEAL operators around the briefing room and could see pale faces and hard expressions everywhere she looked. None of them were strangers to violence, and everyone in this room had both witnessed and actively committed appalling, unspeakable things on their missions. But what she saw now wasn't violence. It was butchery. Literally. The video showed a race she was unfamiliar with, called the Bravlashi, quickly and efficiently killing there. She had to fight down the urge to vomit. Livestock, and processing the human meat with practiced ease, making certain nothing went to waste. It didn't matter to them if their victim was male or female, old or young. Not even children or pregnant women were spared. They simply went about their gruesome business, hanging rows of naked, terrified humans up by their ankles with smooth silver hooks driven through both Achilles tendons. One by one, the humans were jerked into the air to hang upside down, and when they came to a rest, a Bravlashi worker mercilessly slashed their throats and waited for them to stop struggling as the blood drained away. After that, a single drawing cut with a hooked long-bladed knife parted the skin, and all the internal organs spilled out into an obscene pile. Anything left in the body cavity after the first spray of gore was scooped out by hand. The carcass was then pushed aside to make room for the next victim. Although they were an intelligent spacefaring species, at no time did the Bravlashi show any indication that it knew or cared that it was butchering fellow sentient, intelligent beings. "I think we've seen enough," said Vice Admiral Pattersnack, mercifully turning off the holo, then nodding at the only civilian in the room. "I want to thank Mr. Zarryiosiad and his spies for obtaining that video for us. Couldn't have been easy." Before the Admiral could say anything else, Rebecca raised her hand. "Yes, Commander." "Are we certain this footage is real? That video was too good to have been shot by drone. Whoever took it had to be standing in the room." "It's real. We've already identified the victims with facial recognition. All of the Terrans in that video were guests at the vacation resorts on Niagara and were reported missing after the attack," replied Zarryiosiad. "Then who shot the holo?" she pressed. "The video you just watched was produced by the Bravlashi government itself," said Zarryiosiad. "For propaganda?" asked Commander Fogarty, another SEAL. "No, for instructional purposes." Zarryiosiad sighed heavily at Fogarty's blank look. "What you just watched was a how-to video. It shows their best practices for dressing and preparing humans for consumption. This holo has no sound because they shot it with the expectation that they would eventually do a voice-over commentary, and they didn't want the sounds of begging and screaming to be on the holo. We actually have a copy of the script they plan to use for the voiceover. I'm sure you will all be happy to know that the Bravlashi are very careful to stress to the viewer that all of this livestock was caught in the wild, slaughtered in a humane fashion, and processed and packaged in a sterile environment. They are quite rigorous about following all the Bravlashi governmental regulations pertaining to food production. It might also interest you to know that, like pigs, every part of a human being is useful for something." "How soon do we go in to rescue the survivors?" asked First Lieutenant Raffaello. He had a wrathful look on his face that promised righteous vengeance upon the Bravlashi. More than one of the operators leaned forward in their seats. "We don't," said Zarryiosiad. "There are no survivors left alive." He let that fact settle in. After the raid, the Bravlashi were very thorough about cleaning up after themselves and erasing all traces of their presence. It took us nearly 3 weeks just to find out who attacked the colony. After that, it took another week to locate where the prisoners were taken. During that time, every single one of the nearly 1 million prisoners was butchered. The Bravlashi are voracious eaters, and apparently, Terran tastes delicious to them. They compare us to a domestic creature called the Tziltskas, which is analogous to the Terran chicken. A number of Bravlashi chefs are already competing with each other to see who can make the most delicious meal from human meat. The winner will have the honor of serving their finest creation to the Primary of Bravlash and a select few of his closest allies. He hit a button, and the holo reappeared with a picture of a 3-eyed, furry biped with long arms ending in clawed fingertips, a wide mouth with a strong jaw full of multiple rows of shark-like teeth and a stooped, almost hunched appearance. It was wearing an elaborate uniform, covered with geometric designs made of gemstones and precious metals. It looked like a cross between a sloth and a shark, and is dressed like a pre-space generalissimo from some stupid historical drama, trying to show how important it is to everyone else by displaying large, gaudy medals and awards earned far, far away from any battlefields, thought Rebecca. Meet the primary of the Pravlashi, named Harmach. This footage is of the primary returning from the successful raid on Niagara. He commanded the raid himself. Looks pretty fucking pleased with himself, doesn't he? Spat Commander Friedman, as the creature on the hollow waved a hand at the crowd. Do we know if he actually stepped on Terran soil? He did, eventually, not in the first wave, of course, but in the time-honored tradition of politicians everywhere. He landed for a hollow vidop after it was discovered just how defenseless the planet actually was. Niagara is in the Terran green zone, and like the core worlds, the government outlawed all weaponry. They didn't even have a military garrison. Where was the fleet? Asked Commander Freeman. Niagara had no fleet presence. They didn't even have a self-defense frigate to police their own space. All they had was a courier ship, which was supposed to run for help in the highly unlikely event that Space Boogeyman came out of the dark to get him. That's a direct quote from the governor of Niagara when asked about allowing a fleet station to be set up in the system. The courier tried to run, but was destroyed before it could make transit. The crew had their engines set to station keeping, and didn't have enough time to power up before being destroyed. Another decision made by the governor. Having a ship on standby at all times was too expensive for Niagara, said Admiral Pattersnack. Off the record, the Pravlashi did humanity a favor by dragging the governor and his cabinet away to be eaten. That piece of shit and his policies are directly responsible for the deaths of all those people, to include himself and his advisors. We have translated copies of the Pravlashi press reports. As you might expect, they're singing his praises. Apparently, not a single Pravlashi soldier was so much as injured during the raid. You'll also find that their newscasts are omitting the fact that Niagara was a resort world, filled with tourists and newlyweds, and that they were completely unarmed and unable to defend themselves. Even the security forces were armed with only stun batons. The hollow changed to headlines that appeared in the aliens' language, then were quickly translated into Terran Standard. They were each declaring the primary as a military genius, or at the very least, a competent admiral. We didn't have a lot of information on them before now, as they're a relatively small group, only about 30 or so colonies, and their homeworld isn't in our neck of the woods. But their fleet is formidable. We estimate that they outnumber ours by about 5 to 1 in holes, but an emphasis on raiders over ships of the wall. They have an abnormal number of destroyers, cruisers, and heavy cruisers, relatively few battleships, dreadnoughts, and super dreadnoughts. The Pravlashi do not use fighters, so they have no carriers at all, but in keeping with their preference for raiding, they also have a sizable marine force with a respectable number of landing craft. That stands to reason. It would take a lot of cargo space to move 1 million humans in such a short time, added Admiral Pasternak. What they also have, Zarnicki's voice changed to amusement, is an overdeveloped sense of racial invincibility, a trait that we found to be all too common amongst apex predator species like the Pravlashi. They constantly think about what they will do to others, but they never spend much time considering what might happen to them. When you're the toughest kid on the block, you tend to take your superiority for granted. Unfortunately for them, that means our fleets might have near parity in the quality of our shipboard systems and weapons. But their planetary defenses, especially their electronics and data nets, are at least 3 or 4 generations behind ours. Our Black Ops scouts say it was very difficult for their ships to sneak into the inner system, but child's play to crack their homeworld cybersecurity. As such, we have thoroughly penetrated the civilian networks in their home system, and used that access to backdoor their military network as well. That's how we obtained the video. We downloaded it directly from the government's network. We also have access to the primary schedule. That's how we know there will be a celebration in 4 days, where our fellow citizens will be served to the primary and his closest allies as the main course. Please tell me we're on the guest list, said Freeman. Sadly, our invitation seems to have been lost in the mail, said Admiral Pasternak. And since I'm sure that was simply an oversight on their part, we're going to crash his little party. Why not just bomb them from orbit? Or from deep space, using Z-fractional missiles? asked Commander Fogarty. From anyone else, the question might have sounded like reluctance to risk himself on a dangerous mission, but no one in the room would ever be mistaken for a coward. That option was seriously discussed at the highest levels of the government before eventually being dismissed, replied Pasternak. As I said earlier, the Prevlashli did an excellent job covering up all traces of their raid. If we openly attack their system, it would be seen by the galaxy at large as an unwarranted first strike, or at the very least, an escalation. When, not if, the Prevlashli retaliated following a sea-fractional bombardment by our navy, we would find ourselves fighting against them alone. All of our allies would turn their backs on us. We could take them, said Freeman. Probably, but the powers that be would prefer not to find out. Besides, all of you know our government's policy on aggression. War is always the last resort, never the first. We kill the warmongers, not the soldiers, unless we have no other choice. So that means, for your sins, you get to enforce that policy. You'll be happy to know that Mr. Zarnaki's people have compiled a list of targets for us. We're calling it Operation Indigestion. We're going to make examples of everyone included with that raid. Including the primary? Asked Rebecca. Especially the primary, replied Pasternak. He paused to let that point sink in, and waited for any other questions. When none came, he said, Each team leader has been given a data diamond containing the specifics of your team's part in the upcoming raid, including your targets. I know that all of you want your team to be the one that assassinates the primary, so we randomize the targets amongst the 41 teams. There will be no trading assignments. Study your files closely and brief your teams. The Wraith will be entering enemy territory in 4 standard days. The special operation crafts will be launched as soon as we're certain that we're not walking into a trap. That means you'll have 3 days to prep and sim, after which it will be time to teach yet another race why they do not fuck with the Terrans. Ever. The Black Ops ships, still hiding in Prevlashli space, carefully watched every ship in the system with passive sensors, looking for any potential anomalies that might derail the mission, as their hackers continued to work their digital witchcraft on the Prevlashli network. Aside from finding the information that the special operations teams would use, they had been assigned one final task, to find a safe route into the system and onto the planet, and then back again, preferably without being detected. Unfortunately, they hadn't found any gaps in the coverage to exploit, so they wrote a custom virus and inserted it into the system defense net. It was extremely subtle, and had taken nearly 2 weeks to fully implement, but it retasked several satellites and scanning installations which provided overlapping scanning fields and changed the angle of their emitters by a few degrees. This created a narrow gap in their scanning coverage next to the planet's closest moon, which the virus tricked the Prevlashli computers into completely ignoring. 4 days later, the light carrier TSS-9891 Wraith used that gap in coverage to appear undetected in Prevlashli space. They listened for the code that would signal all clear from the scouts, which arrived less than a minute later. As soon as the code was verified, 10 Mark 25 Special Operations craft, each carrying 4 four-man teams, stealthily departed from the carrier and flew in a single file line down a predetermined route cleared by the Black Ops team, past rows of planetary defense batteries that would no doubt have proven to be a formidable obstacle had they known the humans were there. Prevlashkra was a heavily industrialized planet, about 50% larger than Earth, with only about a third of the surface covered by water, which made it look like a brown, ugly ball of mud by human standards. The Mark 25 Special Operations craft was more than capable of landing on the planet, but doing so would increase the likelihood that at least one of the teams would have been discovered by a significant margin. That would have been an acceptable risk if heavier weaponry or specialized equipment was required. But in this case, there was no need. Instead, the SEALs and Commander Montclair's team were launched from low orbit in cylindrical tubes often called coffin nails by the operators, which served as a personal one-use-only drop pod. One by one, the members of the team were launched from the SOCs and descended from the heavens without even a flicker of heat or light to give away their position. Once the coffin nails reached a predetermined height, they kicked into their countergrav and came to a safe rest high in the mountains outside of the capital city. The 4 members of Rebecca's team exited their pods and checked their equipment. Then one by one, they typed in a code on their personal data panels that activated the pod's self-destruct. They watched as special nanites dissolved the coffin nails, leaving behind only a pile of black goo that quickly sank into the ground. Petty Officer First Class Martinez and Seaman First Class Sanford each grabbed the handle of a countergrav harness and pulled 2 bulky cases from the 5th pod before activating the pod's self-destruct. Each case weighed about 900 kilograms, and without the gravity collars, they would have been impossible for the men to lift, but the collars worked as designed, and cases containing the party favor dutifully floated behind them like large rectangular pets. Montclair and her team were operating under total radio and emissions blackout, so the team communicated with hand signals. She pointed toward the peak, and gave them the signal to activate their stealth systems and start climbing as she chambered around in her M318 battle carbine. The 4th member of her team, First Lieutenant Kanazaki, ran ahead to scout the path. They landed on the opposite side of the mountain from the Pravlashi Primary's mountain retreat to minimize the chance of discovery, and faced a 10-kilometer hike over nearly vertical terrain to reach the target. A daunting task, were it not for their countergrav harnesses. Montclair constantly checked her passive scanner for electronic emissions and her thermal scanner for heat sources, looking for potential security zones or witnesses, but her instruments told her it was clear all the way to the peak. She checked the mission timer and realized they were well ahead of schedule. Despite that, she pushed the pace, so they would have enough time to set up their weapon and identify their target before deploying their party favor. A few minutes later, they found an isolated spot on the top of the mountain, just on the other side of the summit. From where they were standing, she had a perfect view of the primary summer palace, a little over 5 kilometers away. Carefully checking sightlines and cover, she gave the order to assemble their gift. The 2 boxers settled to the ground as their countergrav was deactivated, and Martinez and Sanford got to work. "Terrans taste like Tziltskas, but better," said Primary Harmach to his many dinner guests, repeating what he'd heard from the many cooks and chefs who had the privilege of working with such an exotic fare. He punctuated this observation by holding up a thick roasted haunch of meat with the bone still in. The succulent Terran thigh had been expertly prepared by his personal chef, with only a hint of savory spices to give it a more delectable smell without altering the taste in the slightest. The primary unhinged his jaw and stuffed the entire haunch into his mouth, using multiple rows of sharply serrated teeth to shred the meat and rip it away from the bone, then closed all 3 eyelids with bliss as he pulled the bone back out again, stripped clean of the flesh. He opened his eyes again and cracked the femur with powerful hands, then sucked out the jellied marrow with great relish. After he put the 2 halves of the femur on an empty plate, he urged his guests to eat. "Go on, there's plenty more where this came from. And even more than that, once I convince our people to declare war on the Terrans." The secondaries of the Pravlash hunter clans eagerly emulated their leader, greedily tearing into the lavish feast and gobbling down the choicest bits. Delicate ribs were snapped off of steaming carcasses and dipped into a variety of sauces. Bowls full of jellied eyeballs, chilled and sweetened, were slurped down, and the sound of laughter filled the formal dining hall as Harmach presided over the grand meal. The hunters were celebrating Harmach's great victory over a Terran colony during a daring raid, which had achieved complete surprise and resulted in the entire population of the colony, nearly 1 million Terrans, being taken away to be processed into food. After the raid, Harmach sampled Terran flesh and found that it tasted perfectly fine raw, but as an epicure, he knew that with proper preparation, it would be considered a delicacy. He himself enjoyed the finer things in life, and as the primary responsible for a successful campaign, he was entitled to half of the spoils of the entire raid. The feast he was holding now served 3 purposes. The first was to show the hunter clans that he could be very generous to his allies. Though he was the primary of their homeworld of Pravlash Kra, many of the secondaries of rival clans had flatly refused to participate in this raid. Some even went so far as to protest his actions as foolish and needlessly provocative, something that just wasn't done in Pravlashi society. The Terran race had a reputation as a fierce opponent, and more than one diplomat from the other spacefaring predator races cautioned him against provoking their wrath, but Harmach was smart enough to look behind the cautionary tales for the truth. What he found was a great deal of rumor, but very little substance. As far as he could tell, the Terrans had never fought a true interstellar war. Not once. They'd participated, from time to time, helping allied species fend off threats here and there, but they'd never truly been tested in the crucible of battle. Without passing that test, their vaunted reputation was as hollow as the bones piling up beside him. During their invasion, the Pravlash hadn't lost a single raider, Even the youngest of the unblooded pups had emerged from the raid unscathed, a fact made much easier to believe when they learned that none of the Terrans were armed. The most the Terrans could muster was a handful of peacekeeping officers wielding stun batons that had absolutely no effect on the Prevlashi hunters. The third reason for the feast made his smile slip just a touch, though he quickly hid the lapse by bringing a goblet of Terran wine to his lips. He was honest enough with himself to admit that he wasn't a particularly popular leader. His frequent indulgences in the finer things that life had to offer put him at odds with the warrior clans, and the opposition was circling around him as if they sensed his weakness. What he needed was a distraction that would unite his people in a common cause beneath his leadership. A war, even against a race as pathetic as the Terrans, would serve to stave off any potential challengers to his authority. Prevlashi tradition held that during a time of war, no challenges to the primary's authority would be allowed, except in the case of severe incompetence, and it didn't matter if the Prevlash were the aggressors or the victims. Once they were safely at war with the Terrans, his position would be secured. "There's nothing better to unite our hunter clans than common prey," he thought, as his smile returned. "Once others have discovered, as I have, how delicious Terran meat is, I will release the rest of my larder to tempt their palates. My people will demand that we go to war, and when we do, they will learn the same thing as I have. The only thing sweeter than Terran flesh is victory." He turned his attention away from his guests, towards the transparent dome that both sheltered them from the elements and provided a magnificent view of the sun setting behind the mountains. Visions of the glorious future he would soon carve for himself capered and danced in his mind, and he couldn't help but sigh in replete contentment. Martinez and Sanford gave her the thumbs up to let her know the weapon was ready to be deployed, then moved to the minimum safe distance and took cover. Montclair double-checked the status indicator to make certain it had changed from safe to ready, then intensified the magnification on her macro goggles to get a perfect view of the entire dinner party. She centered the image on the slightly plump, three-eyed mongrel dressed in gaudy finery and began recording, as he happily and obliviously munched away on the remains of one of his human victims. Then she panned the camera to show the grisly feast in its entirety. After scanning the table and the faces of the guests as evidence, she left the camera on as she switched her HUD to targeting mode, and aimed the crosshairs at the primary Triclops' ugly face, just in time to catch him turning to look at the mountain they were standing upon, with a stupid smile on his face. Perfect. "Eat this, fucker." She ruthlessly stabbed the firing stud with a convoluted finger and activated the missile. The 1814.37 kg Annihilator gravitic missile worked as designed, accelerating at 10,000 Gs in a straight line that burned through the thick atmosphere like a death ray. The Annihilator carried neither an explosive warhead nor a sophisticated guidance system, but they were close enough to the target that the weapon needed neither. Instead, it carried two things: a field penetrator, designed to pour through protective force fields like the one surrounding the primary summer palace, and a powerful but short-lived gravity generator, which would act much like a black hole, pulling everything within a half-kilometer violently toward it and crushing it into a super-dense ball of material that would disappear into the ground at the bottom of the deep crater it left behind. The Annihilator activated a fraction of a second later, destroying the Triclops, his guests, the celebration dome, the building it was connected to, the surrounding buildings, and everything else within a 1 kilometer diameter. Mission accomplished. Rebecca checked her HUD to see how the other teams had done. One by one, green status indicators flashed, denoting successful engagements by all of the other SEAL teams that had been deployed around the planet. When the last one burned green, she finally gave the order to exfiltrate. The 4-person fire team activated their secondary counter-gravity harnesses, designed to carry their user into low orbit, and shot skyward, where they awaited pickup. Their cloaked Terran Navy Mark 25 Special Operations craft homed in on their beacons and safely collected all 4 of her team members, then glided to pick up 3 other teams. Once the SEALs were back, it wove its way through the thick orbital defenses of the Prevlashi homeworld and into the safety of deep space. After all 10 SOCs were aboard with their precious cargo intact, the TSS-9891 Wraith disappeared once again into the darkness. The Prevlashi never even knew they were there. Lieutenant Commander Montclair put the hollow image of Primary Hammock's final moment on her desktop and adjusted its angle until she was satisfied, then sat down to write her after-action report. It had been less than 24 hours, but copies of the video the teams had shot were already finding their way into the hands of Terran diplomats, who would quietly share them with the emissaries of hundreds of worlds, coupled with a warning: if you attack us, we will retaliate, and your leaders will die. This wasn't the first time a Terran planet had been attacked and scoured by a rival, nor would it be the last. The universe was a vast and dangerous place, after all, with terrors and wonders in equal measure out there, still waiting to be discovered. But of all the races that had given in to temptation and attacked the Terran population, none had ever chosen to attack a second time. The military had learned how to deal with naked aggression a long time ago, in war after protracted war, quagmire after quagmire. If you kill the people who start the wars, instead of the soldiers who are forced to fight and die on their behalf, their successors will be less eager to fight. Sometimes a single bullet, or gravitic missile in this case, put into the right person at the right time can end a war before it begins. Never send a fleet to do an assassin's job.